Hi everyone. This week we're going to start looking at our first civilization, which is ancient Egypt, and of course the focus will be on sustainability. Now we always need to talk about our sources here, so we pretty much have the same as before. So as I put here, heavily dependent on archaeology. So there's, as you know, most of you are familiar with ancient Egypt and everything that goes on there. We do have some written material though now, and what we'll see is that the Egyptians were pretty keen on keeping records of everything from crop yields to labor to the amount of food that people eat and so on. So at least we'll have those sources. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. So this is a class on sustainability, but many times in our class, we don't actually have eyewitness accounts or people who say, wow, look at how terrible we've done to, look all the terrible things we've done to our environment. So we don't have something like that. We don't have how people reacted, individuals reacted. However, we do have records on how the government acted. So if for, say for example, they issue a decree on storing food, you can probably guess that there are issues with the amount of food being grown and maybe climate change or human impact on the land. And again, most of what we're talking about here in ancient Egypt is naturally occurring climate change. So we're looking at how they were impacted by that. I just want to remind you here, and you'll have to stop the video to read through this. We read the Tainter article the very first week, and it compared Rome with the Mayans. And there was this really interesting quote that as I was reading it, I realized it's really talking about ancient Egypt as well. So why don't you stop the video and read through this, and you can find this on Tainter page 209. And now that you've come back, in a few slides, I will replace the word Maya with ancient Egypt or with Egypt, and you can see that what's going on there is pretty much the same as what Tainter is talking about here. And in terms of looking at our specifics, so we'll be looking at the Old Kingdom. I'll break down ancient Egypt, the history of ancient Egypt here in just a minute. But what we see that in the Old Kingdom, this is the pyramid times, where if you think about all these great, like the Khufu pyramid or the Great Pyramid, these were built in the Old Kingdom. And think about the Tainter article. So his article is talking about how society becomes more complex. You then end up spending more energy. You then have to build more, which more energy is needed to input into the whole thing, which of course in the ancient world, energy is really agriculture. That was really the money of the ancient world. And then what we see towards the end of the Old Kingdom, and we'll get into the details, is that you've got a drying period, and then you have sort of a collapse. And then what Tainter has to say on page 210 is pretty applicable. Just as ancient societies did, we increase in complexity and costliness to solve problems, when he's referring to our own issues with sustainability and all the environmental issues we're going through. Okay, now I'll give you a quick and dirty history of ancient Egypt. So here is a map of Egypt, and let me see if I can get my little highlighter to work here. This is the northern part of Egypt, and it's called Lower Egypt. And then the southern part of Egypt is called Upper. I know it can be confusing. You just have to get used to that as you read through some of the sources. And that's because the source of the Nile is much further south, and the river is flowing towards the Mediterranean. So it starts way before Upper Egypt, but it flows through Upper Egypt and then to Lower Egypt, and then into this area which is called the Delta region, where in ancient Egypt it spread out into different rivers and then drained into the Mediterranean. Now, everything in ancient Egypt really is dependent on the Nile. So you get monsoons or heavy rains in the Ethiopian highlands. This leads to lots of water and lots of sediment, more importantly, traveling up the Nile. And what happens is, and I've got these here, you've got something called inundation. And this is when the river floods. So it starts to flood in the south around August in normal years. and then it's still flooding in November, especially up in the northern parts in Lower Egypt. And then you got something called the emergence between November and March. That's after the flood has gone through. Now what happens in the flood is that it's carrying a whole bunch of water, and the water is carrying a whole bunch of silt from the Ethiopian highlands and other areas as it's traveling through its channel. As it floods, it spreads water on the land as well as silt. And then in the emergence, what's really happening here is that the land is emerging again. So the flood is going down, the Nile is going back into its banks, and it's flowing out to the Mediterranean. This was planting time because all that soil has now been exposed and it's wet. And there's lots of sediment, so lots of nutrients for plants. So that's when the Egyptians start planting. And then later you've got the drying time or summer between March and August. That's when the Nile is typically at its lowest, and that's when you are harvesting everything in preparation for the next inundation. Okay, this map is showing you sort of as we lift out higher. So we've got Egypt down here. This is to show you just the other civilizations that were around during this period. So you've got up here the Anatolians, you've got the Hittites, which make a big impact on Egyptian history. You've got Phoenicia here, or modern-day Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, all those are. So this is just to give you a bigger view of what's happening in the region. Now, don't worry about memorizing this. I do teach a whole class on the history of ancient Egypt, and we focus on sustainability. So some of this I'll cover in much more greater detail in that semester-long class. But essentially, the chronology of ancient Egypt, you've got the Paleolithic. Paleo means old, so and lithic means stone, so the Old Stone Age. Then you've got the Middle Stone Age, and then you've got the Neolithic, and you all know the Neolithic is when they started farming. You have a period in Egyptian history called the pre-dynastic, and that means pre-king, before you've got the pharaohs. And then the Old Kingdom, so the time when they're building all these great pyramids. I've given you the dates here. Now, in Egyptian history, you have these time periods called the intermediate periods. And usually it's when part of the society collapses and then something comes in the middle, and then you get the new reorganization coming out. Now, in the case of Egyptian history, you've got the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period. Then you've got the Middle Kingdom, where you see another rise in buildings and so on. And then you have a second intermediate period. Then finally you have the New Kingdom, and then a third intermediate period, and then something called the late period. We're not going to look into this particular area. And then you've got where the Romans come in and take over Egypt. So I've got blue arrows here. We're going to concentrate on the Old Kingdom in this lecture. And then in the next one, I'm going to look at the first intermediate period when there was a collapse of the Old Kingdom. And then in the third lecture, I'm going to talk about what's happening in the New Kingdom, because you get a drying period again, and you get all of these strikes by tomb workers. So we're going to take a closer look at that in a bit. Just to let you know, so that the area around Egypt hasn't always been as dry as it is today. We have something called the African humid period, 14,800 to 5,500 before present, where this whole area was cooler and wetter. They actually had monsoons in this area. Right now, you might get 1.5 inches of rain per year, but before, during this wet period, you had quite a bit of rain. Now, when the rain disappeared, that changed a lot of things, or when the climate got drier. So you had an extinction of animals, so hyenas, warthogs, zebra, water buffalo. And then what's really interesting is around 5,500 before present is when the Egyptians began to organize themselves and into a community organization or civilization, however you want to call that. You have to wonder, did they understand their climate? Well, we know that the Egyptians, throughout a big part of their history, kept track of the Nile River levels. So they knew that if you had extremely high floods, you would have trouble with planting. They knew if you had very low floods, you'd have problems with planting because it'd be too dry. So they tried to keep track of these things. They also understood what was going on because they built storehouses. So they knew that in some years the Nile would not flood like it normally did, and you would have crop issues. So in that respect, they certainly understood the flow of the Nile, or at least anticipated some problems that could come when the Nile overflowed or underflowed. What did these ancient Egyptians eat? Well, this is important to think about because obviously this is what they're growing and harvesting. So wheat and barley, pretty common in the ancient world. Beans, vegetables, dairy products, and you can see all this, of course, fish because they live around the Nile. Poultry, and then this symbol, I let the PowerPoint pick the symbol, but it really should be beef. It should be a cow, but I put if you were wealthy, so it read the word wealth and put a diamond there. So we know people ate beef, but not the poorer people. In terms of the economy, which is really important to think about because that's part of sustainability, so the sustaining of the society during this particular period. We know that technically the pharaoh owned the entire land. Now, some of this land was broken up into what I call religious estates. So where there are temples and they control the land around the temples, and usually that's the agricultural land. You do have some instances of individually owned land. The Egyptians, when they got organized, were great record keepers. So they took a census of people, animals, and crops. And the reason you take a census of people is, of course, for tax purposes. You take a census of animals to know how many animals are around so that you can eat and then plan ahead, and crop yields exactly the same. Now, in the Old Kingdom, it was not slave-based. So there's this sort of running myth that during the Old Kingdom, all these massive pyramids were put together by slaves. That's not the case. That happens later in Egyptian history, but not during this period. I mentioned the Old Kingdom period is really known as the pyramid period, where you've got these massive building projects started, like these pyramids, and we'll talk about these in just a little bit. You do see trade increasing during the Old Kingdom. That's both trade within the country, just like with the southern part, with the northern part, and outside of Egypt. So you definitely see that. Here's one of my favorite maps I like to show students when you think about what's happening in the Old Kingdom pyramid. So if you're reading through your sources, sometimes you'll see where the Old Kingdom is referred to as the 3rd to the 7th dynasties. Just be aware that sometimes the 3rd dynasty isn't included in that. It depends on who you're reading. But what this chart is showing you is this is the time along the bottom. So this is BC, so 2600 BC, 2500, and so on. Along here is the millions of cubic meters of stone being used by the Egyptians. And so these are the names of the pharaohs. We're not going to go through all these, but Pharaoh Djoser, and then so on. And then look at what's happening here. Snefru, Pharaoh Snefru. And you can see this goes all the way through almost into the New Kingdom. There's nothing that compares with the amount of stone that was used during the time of Snefru. And then you've got Khufu. So Khufu is the pharaoh who builds the Great Pyramid. And then Khafre, and so on. And you can see this pretty steep decline in the amount of building that's being done. Now, this is where the first intermediate period is. So Pepi II is considered to be the last great pharaoh of the Old Kingdom. I'll tell you right now, what we see is that this starts a much drier period. So what starts happening is that the environment gets drier, crops are harder to grow, there's famine, especially at this period around Pepi and a little bit after, and things start to fall apart. And you can see there's essentially no building during this period. Now it picks up again in the Middle Kingdom, so you do see some buildings and so on, but nothing like what's happening during this Old Kingdom period. And one thing to think about is that you need a very organized society, wealthy society, to build these buildings. So it's not something like, our class of 30 students could go out and build, a pyramid that's 400 feet tall. It just can't happen. You need a large population. You need a way to feed those people, and so on. So this isn't just showing you a simple chart of pyramid size. It's really talking about the government of Egypt, the society of Egypt, the economy, the amount of agriculture that needs to be grown to feed all of these people, and the organization, and so on. And of course, you have to think about the environment. They have to grow all these crops and all of these and keep all of these animals enough to feed a population to grow or to build something like this. In terms of a taxation system, now no big surprise, you get a pretty complex tax system starting under Snefru. Now remember that Snefru is the one where you see that giant amount of building. So he needs wealth, and he needs wealth from his people. So he starts collecting tax in terms of agriculture. That was really the basis of the tax. I mentioned that a lot of the land was run by the temple complexes, and they oversaw agricultural production in the country. So what they would do is they would lease out individual land plots, and then they would say to the owner or the renter, you know, we get 50% of your crop for taxes. And then those are all collected and then sent off to the central, sometimes to the central government. It didn't work quite like that. A lot of it was actually kept in the temple complexes and then given out to the people as they're doing work or whatever for the government. I just wanted to show you a little bit about Djoser's pyramid. So if you remember Djoser on that chart, he was one of the first ones that had a big uptick in the amount of stone being used. This is called a step pyramid because it looks like there are steps. So, and you know, I really want you to start thinking about these. I mentioned this just a little bit ago. You know, where did all this stone come from? Because this is the first time that pyramids are being built out of stone and not mud brick. So the previous ones were mud brick. This is now stone. Up at the top, I give you a few details. There's a wall around the entire complex. And then, not so important for our class, but there's a temple that juts off the front that was a special room for the pharaoh's statue. But think about sustainability. Where did all this stone come from? You know, how was it removed? How was it transported to this site? And think about the humans that are involved in this, because these are the people who are building this. Now, we don't have a slave system during this period. I'll show you one of the building areas in just a bit. But these people had to be fed. They needed to be, I put watered here. They need to be watered. Actually, most of them were probably drinking beer at this point, which was safer than water. You also need a place to house all these people. And then later on, you need a group of people that upkeeps these buildings because they were really temples built to glorify the pharaoh. This is part of the step, or actually part of the, like a cross section, the top is a cross section of the pyramid, step pyramid, where if you just cut it in half and then looked inside. This view is if you look straight down, like if you're in a helicopter and you're looking straight down. So there's massive amounts of work being put into this. So his first pyramid wasn't even a pyramid, it was called a mastaba. And that was just a flat top building. He wanted it bigger. They built this one, and then he wanted it even bigger, which ended up being the building that we have today. Now, if you look over top and look down, it's not just a building, and you can see that here as well. There are chambers under here. So I've given you, some of the information on this particular pyramid. So 11,700,000 cubic feet of clay and stone were used. The base itself is almost 400 by 360 feet. So it's a massive building, a massive complex to do, not including all the chambers that were built under this thing. And then here's just another shot showing you under the base of the pyramid and what all that looked like. It's pretty incredible building. But again, think about sustainability. Where's all this effort coming from? Where are the stone coming from? How much effort it took to dig all this out and remove all the rubble. Okay, and then you've got the Great Pyramid. This is just another pyramid. This is probably the most famous pyramid in the world. This was built after Snefru's pyramid, and Khafre is the one. He's not the peak, that's Snefru, but he's a little bit down in terms of the volume of stone. And so what you see, you can get a good scale of this. These are people down here. Now this pyramid had a coating on top, of a stone coating. So you get the pyramid being built with stone, and then they put a nice, beautiful flat stone on the outside. A lot of that hasn't survived this time. And then, of course, you've got the famous Sphinx in front. Now, what's really interesting is that we have evidence, archaeological evidence, of a town that was built by one of the pyramids. I'll show you a scheme here in just a bit, of Menkare's pyramid. So you've got 3 of these massive pyramids in a row. there's a spot called the builder's quarters. And we think around this area there must have been at least 10,000 people living. According to records, they're eating 4,000 pounds of meat every single day. So think about the amount of animals it takes to butcher, all the human effort to butcher, to cook, to transport, and then to get all these people fed. And if you look at more of the archaeology in terms of what kind of other animals in terms of meat, you've got sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. And what they're doing is that they're looking at the number of pig bones so that they can extrapolate how many animals are actually there. And then all this data, you need 22,000 cattle and 55,000 sheep and goats just to feed these people. And then who's taking care of all these animals? You need 20,000 people just to keep track or take care of the animals before they're slaughtered. And I've given you a link here. I know you probably can't click on that in the slide. I'll try and remember to put it in our course so that you can take a look at this. But this is probably where this building is. A lot of it. There's a lot of it that hasn't been uncovered yet. And this is that pyramid of Menkaure. So this is the Great Pyramid here. Oh, sorry. This is the Great Pyramid. And then you've got Khafre's pyramid, and then you've got Menkaure's, and all the buildings that are, around this entire area. Okay, so here's where I switched out Egyptian for Maya in that Tanger article. So what I'd like you to do is to pause the video in just a second while but first let me go through this. So, what we're going to look at in this particular article is again, I've lifted out the Mayan and inserted Egyptian into this, where, it talks about investments in monumental construction grew and grew, and the article is talking about the Mayans, which we haven't looked at yet, but this sounds exactly to me like the Egyptians. Hydraulic engineering, that's water. So getting water from one place to the other, it changed. Natural systems, natural resource systems. So in this case, in Egypt, you can think about stone. Human management system increases the cost because as you're building these buildings bigger and bigger, you need more and more input. So go ahead and stop the video here. Read this quote. And again, I've switched Egyptian for Mayan, but I think it'll make sense once you read through it. Okay, so when you think about food production and distribution in ancient Egypt, of course, it's all dependent on the Nile again. You do have the flooding of the Nile, and there's farming. You also have irrigation projects where in irrigation, they build canals to lead the water where it normally wouldn't go. And we've got archaeological evidence that goes way back to the first pharaohs of them standing over and digging the canals themselves. Whether they did that or not, I'm not quite sure. But then you have to start thinking about, okay, we know that they farmed. We know that they had irrigation. Can we start figuring out crop yields and how they distributed the food, and then food storage? So all these things, and the answer is yes. And we'll look at a few of these in the upcoming slides. But first, you want to think about tools when you think about farming. So we have archaeological evidence of wooden hoes, plows, both wooden and metal, and then metal tip adzes, which are just these type of tools that you use in agriculture. And so they had to devise these, make them, and a lot of it was built out of local materials. Irrigation. So again, it's built, putting water from one place to the next. In some, we know that areas that were flooded were controlled with gates. So they had to build gates strong enough to hold back the water, and then they could open it, flood an area, and then shut the gates to keep the water in. Much later in Egyptian history, they had something called lift irrigation, which is where, just what it sounds like, you might have like a lever system that grabs the water, and then instead of you using your effort, you can just swing a pole. And then you put water, you might be putting water higher than it normally is, like the water level. So you lift it up and then you pour it in. That's what lift irrigation is. So we know that they definitely did that. I've got some of these things here. You're going to have to stop the video in just a minute. I told you that the Egyptians were great record keepers. So this is a page from a record that was really talking about the upkeep of a temple complex. And so let me just get a little closer so I can read this. So you can see jars of beer, how many jars of flour, how much bread is there, where is it coming from, and so on. So they kept track of a lot of different things that came into these temple complexes, and then all the material that went out. So again, remember that these are really sort of the basis of the economy in ancient Egypt, and they would collect taxes in terms of agriculture. So a lot of this would come in from the people who are renting out the land, and then it's all going out usually. And then keeping track of material. So not only did they keep track of the amount of food that was in, but they kept track of tools and different types of things. And were they repaired? Were the tools repaired at some point? So we've got records for all of this. And I've given you the sources for this. So there's a book by Kemp on Egyptian history on page 18. And it's the name of the papyrus here, in case you're wondering. In case you want to look that up, Kemp is a very popular book, so it's easy to find. Okay, in terms of rationing, now I don't mean rationing of like only giving out a portion. Really what it is it's the payments. So the government or these temples collect all of this and then they ration it out for payments. It's really the whole basis of the economy. We know that scribes kept track of everything, and then when they even had these little mathematical problems that you would have to learn if you were going to be a scribe in one of these areas, where they would measure the grain that's coming in, and in the papyri they call them hekat, which is a measurement. So it's almost 5 liters of grain, and what they do is they measure the grain when it goes onto the ship, and then they measure it when it goes off the ship because they want to know if anything was stolen. And then they give you ways to think about how you can calculate the amount you will actually need. So, and you can see this is a fairly, well, maybe, I mean, it's complicated to me because I'm not really into math. So it may not be complicated to you, but this is what the scribes had to deal with measurements. They were very specific about even very, very tiny measurements. One thing you will notice when you're reading through the sources, and I briefly mentioned this a bit before, the Egyptians were growing wheat. A lot of times people did not drink the water. So water wasn't considered totally safe. What was safe was beer. And so beer was made when you make a dough. You take wheat and you make a dough, and then you put that in water and then it ferments. It's almost like sourdough today, but not quite the same thing. It ferments, and then you have a little bit of alcohol in there. And what the alcohol does is it kills the germs. And so people could drink that. So most people drank beer, and one of the payments that we know for these workers in ancient Egypt was beer. So they would get beer as a payment. And then, you know, if you had different people getting food for payment, which is what happened, there were also these interesting calculations on figuring out how many would receive loaves, the loaves of bread, if you had 100, which is what this example is. So the method of distributing 100 loaves amongst 10 men, if the skipper, the crew, the leader, and the doorkeeper received double. And so they give you the entire calculation here. But what you're really looking at is, you know, a laborer would get about 10 loaves, and then he'd get 1/3 to 2 jugs of beer. That would be his payment. Keeping track of labor, they kept track, it's really incredible. They kept track of everything. So they kept track of the number of bricks, the amount of straw used, if you're talking about straw bricks, the amount of earth used, the amount of rubble, sand, volume would all be calculated down to like the whatever the calculation is, the weight or the size. And then what they ended up doing with that is they could figure out how much material they need to build a building or build a pyramid, how many people you need, how many rations or how much food and drink you're going to have to need to get these people to work. So it was a pretty incredible system when it did work. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm already getting way over the time that I really should be in terms of making these videos. But We know that the Egyptians built boats, and they built boats out of cutting their own lumber, which is not something you really think about from ancient Egypt, but in the beginning they definitely had trees that grew along the Nile. They ended up cutting most of them down, but in the beginning they had trees for their own uses. In the beginning we know that they had copper tools, and I talked about some of these in terms of working agriculture. We also know that some of these were used for stone. So when you make a block of stone, you need chisels, and they had sand polishers to make it look nice, and so on. Here's an example of wood use, and this is the building of a boat. So what you have here is sort of a model boat, and then what you have here is a drawing of a boat, and they look the same. So you've got sort of the lower part, and then the sides go up. And you can see how people sat in this area. This is a person. I don't know if you can see. This is sort of probably a pharaoh, because they have the crown on top. And then you can see down here some of the details about some of these ships. So some of them are found in the first dynasty, which is the number one time period, or the earliest time period where we think they had kings. There are probably kings before this, but right now it's still called the first dynasty. They not only built ships out of wood, but they also built them out of native grasses. Later, when they started using up all of their lumber, they had to import wood, and primarily it was cedar, because cedar doesn't rot, and it's really good to put in the water. We also know that wood was used in tombs, so they would make wooden coffins or rooms that were sort of lined in wood, and so they were definitely using that. Oh, that isn't meant to be there. I think I have in my next slide. There it is, the royal ship of Khufu. So this was a ship buried around the pyramid of Khufu. There were actually on all four sides ships buried. And this one was in good enough condition that archaeologists could actually put it all back together. So pretty amazing woodworking and the use of wood in the Old Kingdom. Now, where did the wood go? I just told you a little bit ago. They ended up cutting most of their native wood down, and it did not grow back. So they end up having to import a good amount of it. Now, around the end of the Old Kingdom, and again, these are before present dates, so 4181 to 4055 before present, the Nile started to fail to flood on multiple years. We know that this is getting close to the area I just talked about, where it was wetter and it starts to get drier. You've got something known, and we looked at the 8200 before present event. There's also something called the 4200 before present event, which was increased aridification, so drying, essentially what it is. You have a decrease in rainfall. Other civilizations were also having this issue, but we'll just concentrate in Egypt. So when you don't get as much water going up onto the banks, you get salt built up. So, and most plants do not like salt. Usually what happens, if you look at the archaeological record, you've got wheat growing in some places. Sometimes if you see wheat being replaced with barley in the archaeological record, it could indicate that the saline levels were getting higher, and barley doesn't mind it so much as wheat. So anyway, during this time, you've got a decrease in rainfall, a decrease in the amount of the flood. You've got salinity building up in the soil. And that means your agricultural output would be reduced. So think about all the people you needed to build the pyramids. If you can't feed them, you can't build those buildings. And then when you don't have the Nile moving like it normally did in terms of the flow rate, you get increased evaporation, which really means less water for people to use. Now we've got a lot of evidence for this particular drying period. And some of this I'm pulling out of this article, which you can find if you search the library. We've got pollen evidence. So we've talked about pollen before in this class. We've got charcoal evidence of increased fire use. So they're using the plants that they have to burn them. Interestingly enough, we've got some evidence from the Delta region, which is mollusks. So mollusks are these animals with shells. They show that there's a reduction of them, or there's evidence that they're having a hard time living in the delta. which shows a reduction of fresh water. So if you think about the Nile flowing from south to north and dumping out into the Mediterranean, that's fresh water. So when there's not the flow and the push, same salty water from the Mediterranean can come back in and sit in the delta. So we've got evidence of saltwater intrusion into the delta. And then what's really fascinating is there's a study on human teeth that show a drying period where you can look at oxygen isotopes in the teeth. And I've given you the article here if you want to get more of the details for that. Another thing too, we've got evidence of the drying period with these things called the Nile meters. So Nile, you can see Nile, it's a meter that measures the height of the Nile. So now there are numbers of places in Egyptian archaeology where you can see this. The problem is that they're not all zeroed at the same spot. So you have to really be careful about the data you're using. But it is showing in general that between 3000 BC and 2500 BC, which is right as you get to the Old Kingdom, you start to see a drop of 3 feet in height of the Nile. And that's a lot of water if you think about how long the Nile is and the way that it's set up. And again, if there's a book chapter called From Hunters to Farmers, and it's written by Bootser. So he's one of the authors I've had you read on page 106, talks about this drop. So I'm going to stop this part of the video. Sorry it's so long. In the next part, I'll continue on. We'll look at the first intermediate period, and then we'll look at what's happening in the New Kingdom.